Sylvia, you're on mute.
Okay, sorry, it was on mute. Welcome everybody, thank you for being here. Our special guest tonight was plagued and embarrassed by her name, and it was made worse by nomadic childhood that made it impossible to build lasting relationships. Shenandoah Chefalo developed a tough skin at an early age. Along the way, she learned to deal with disappointment, push through discomfort, overcome adversity, and accurately gauge people, qualities that have helped her succeed. After spending nearly 20 years as a law office administrator, Shenandoah became unsettled by the ever revolving door of people into the criminal justice system and set out to find a way to change it. She attended Coach U and became a certified life coach. Working through the program, Shenandoah began to understand her childhood in a way that she never had before. She began researching and learning that there were nearly 400,000 children in foster care system each day in the United States. Out of those children, nearly 61% would age out of the system without having a place to live. Nearly 50% would end up incarcerated within 2 years of aging out. And almost 80% of the people on death row are former foster alumni. These and other statistics made Shenandoah realize that she had to do something. She set out on a mission to tell her story and educate the general public about the grim realities of life that she had always tried to hide. Through education, she believes that some of the grassroots solutions that she offers, as well as ideas and solutions from others, could change the lives of children and the landscape of the country. Shenandoah Chefalo is a graduate of Michigan State University, holding a Bachelor's of Arts with a major in interdisciplinary studies in social science, a core essentials graduate from Coach U, and volunteers with several organizations, both locally, nationally, and internationally. Shenandoah Chefalo is the author of multiple award winner Garbage Bag Suitcase, an ebook entitled Setting Your Vision and Defining Your Goals, and is also working on another book, Hiking for Stillness. She is the president and owner of Chefalo Consulting, trauma-informed specialist focused on holistic trauma-informed project management, implementation, training, and consulting services. She is also the co-founder of 4600 and Counting, a grassroots movement to bring awareness and change to the missing youth of the foster care system. Shenandoah, thank you so much for being here with us this evening. We really appreciate you coming.
Sylvia, thank you for having me, and thanks everyone for coming this evening to spend some of your time with me and to talk about sort of the long-term impacts of trauma, right? And that impact on all of us. So I'm so excited to be with you. For those of you I can actually see on the screen, I love seeing your smiling faces, by the way. It feels good to just be connected in that way. So I'm going to share with you some slides tonight, and we may or may not get through them all, right? To me, that is less important than answering questions you may have. And so I'm going to spend the first part of this presentation talking about my personal story, my time before, during, and after foster care. And I just want you to know that you can feel free to ask whatever questions you have. I think it's so valuable when we share lived experience with each other, and that there's so much for all of us to learn from that. And then in addition to sharing part of my personal story with you, we're also going to dive into trauma. So we'll talk a bit about adverse childhood experiences. So many people on the call today may have heard of adverse childhood experiences as a study. Others that may be new. And so we'll dive into some of that area. And then I'll introduce some strategies related to trauma as well. One of the things that excites me as a speaker and as a trainer and a consultant is not always sort of focusing on the doomsday message, right? Like the trauma, but what can we do about it? So we know that it has an impact. Everyone on this call, I believe, knows that. And we just want to be sure that we leave with some strategies and some ideas about what we can do about that going forward as well. If you have questions, please feel free to put those in the chat. We have staff here who will interrupt and we'll dive into those questions as we're talking about it. As I mentioned, the slides will be made available to you after the presentation. And I would much rather spend time on topics that are of value to you than getting through slides per se. So with that, let's start off. So one of the fun things that I get to do is that I'm a super big sports person, right? So I know you might have stole my quarterback from Michigan because I'm in Michigan currently, even though I'm a California girl at heart. Rumor has it you stole my quarterback and then won a Super Bowl out there. So I'm a little angry right now, a little angry, I gotta tell you. So I love sports and I love college sports. And so anybody who's been following the Rose Bowl might know my Big Ten teams have been putting a little hurt on you out on the West Coast lately in the Rose Bowl. And although I bleed green and I love Michigan State, my love for Michigan State is much deeper than sports and much deeper than our football team or our basketball team. Turns out we also have a winning golf team right now, but right, I digress. So it's deeper than that. And I want you to just hold on to that for a minute. And we're going to circle back to that conversation. What I want to tell you about is my life currently. So I live in a very small rural community in northern Michigan where we had a snowstorm yesterday. So as you're all enjoying your 80-degree weather, Tracy and Sylvia were teasing me before the call started about how great it is. I remember those days, but I have a beautiful daughter who graduated high school during COVID. So she's a 2020 grad, right? And then right after that, accepted her college invitation to go to school in London, England. And so at 18, she packed her bags and moved herself across the country because no one was allowed to go with her, right? We were all in lockdown from COVID. And so she's currently attending school in London. But when she turned 10 years old, we decided as a family to forego Christmas. We completely gave up Christmas. No Christmas tree, no lights, no presents. It also meant we didn't have to attend Christmas parties, which can be both good and bad. And we decided instead that we would travel and have experiences together as a family. And that journey has taken us around the world and around the globe. And right before COVID, it took us to the highest freestanding mountain in the world, Mount Kilimanjaro in Tanzania, Africa. And we were able in that journey and with a crew of a lot of people who helped make it to the top of Kilimanjaro to raise awareness about children aging out of the foster care system. So it's near and dear to our hearts for a lot of reasons. So I live in northern Michigan, as I mentioned. This is the view outside when I'm doing dishes. This is the view I get to see in the sun setting. And of course, my emotional support dog, we all are thankful for our pets. This is Bernie, who is asleep next to me as we speak, wondering why we're not watching TV right now is his big gripe, I think. But that wasn't always my life. So one of the first questions I often get asked is, gosh, Shenandoah is such a unique name. How did you get that name? And what I joke with people around the globe is that you have to sort of be born in California in the early 70s to get the name Shenandoah. And people laugh and my Californians will understand, right? Is that I was just born at a different time in a different place where children had these unique names given to them. Now, I would have loved to have been a Sylvia or a Tracy, to be honest with you. I would have done anything as a child to have those names. But I had Shenandoah and it was a name that I needed to grow into. But it also summarizes a lot of my childhood. So I was born in San Diego, California. I spent a lot of my very young youth in Long Beach, but we moved frequently. I had a very nomadic childhood. We lived in Las Vegas, Phoenix, Salt Lake City, Denver, Colorado. I call this the reverse Oregon Trail, right? So if we know about American history, the settlers moved from the east to the west on the Oregon Trail. And I was going from west to east backwards on this. And during that time, before the age of 13, We moved over 50 times and I attended over 35 schools. This was because my mom suffered from a dual diagnosis of mental health issues, and she was medicating those mental health issues with both drugs and alcohol. We were often homeless in my youth. There are many stories of my youth of having not only food insecurity, but frankly starving, right? So it wasn't just about insecurity. Most of my meals came only from meals that I received at school during school hours, and depending on the schools that I attended. So some schools also served breakfast, which is a little more common now, but was a little more infrequent in my youth. And then, of course, there's the breaks in which food was often not available. And so that was my life. And there's sad stories involved with that, right? There's mental and emotional neglect and physical abuse. But there's also happy memories from that. And there's excitement in moving and traveling and living a nomadic existence. And there's happiness also within the pain. There are good memories mixed with the bad and painful memories. The summer before I turned 13, we made our way back to Michigan, where my mom was originally from. And it's in Michigan where I entered the foster care system. So we had made our way back to Michigan. We had been in Michigan a few months when I was sent back to California to stay with an aunt over the summer. And when I returned to Michigan, nobody was at the airport to collect me. Now, you might recall, prior to 9/11 in the United States, you could go to a gate and pick up people who were flying in. There was a time where you didn't wait outside in the parking garage. You actually went into the gate that they were to find them. And when nobody was there, I convinced the flight attendant to allow me to take the public bus to my grandmother's house, who happened to be the only person in the community that I knew. And so the flight attendant agreed, and I got on a city bus and went to my grandmother's home. And my grandmother was living in a senior living community. You're familiar with these, right? You have your individual house or apartment, but you get together for meals and events and do things together. And that's where my grandmother was staying at the time. And I was allowed to stay, and my grandmother took me in, and we thought that my mom would reappear. So during my childhood, my mom had disappeared often for days or weeks at a time, and I was left to fend for myself. And I was very comfortable doing that. In fact, that was very normal to my existence. But this was really the first time another adult had been involved in my mom disappearing. And so when my mom didn't appear after a day or two, I know that my grandmother was concerned, although she didn't share that with me. But after 2 or 3 weeks, the people who owned the facility became concerned. You can imagine that a young girl with a significant trauma history does not stand out in a senior living community at all. She's no disturbance whatsoever, for those of you who remember being 13 and how you might have behaved, right? And so I was faced with a decision that they were either going to kick my grandmother out of her living facility and she was going to become homeless with me, or I was going to have to call the authorities on myself. Now, this wasn't an easy decision. I think as adults, when we hear this, we're like, super simple. We're just going to call the police. We're going to report this and we're going to march on. But for a 13-year-old girl with a significant trauma history, that was not an easy decision. I knew I could take care of myself in the streets, or felt confident that I could, but I could not do that with my grandmother, who was sick at the time. I knew that that was a liability. But I also did not trust the police. So like many youth who grew up in the conditions that I grew up with, I did not trust the police. I had saw brutality in my community. They had been called in instances where my mom had been the victim of violent crimes in which no arrests were ever made. And because of the lifestyle we lived, I had also been trained from a young age to mistrust the police, right? So that mistrust that was built into me, that was taught to me by my mom and by other adults, was backed up by the actions that I saw. So I wasn't really comfortable calling the police, to be honest. It wasn't an easy decision. And that was complicated, that in my life and in the way I was raised, no one wanted to be known as a rat. And calling the police sort of labeled you instantaneously as a tattletale or someone who was trying to get someone else in trouble. And so that weighed heavy on me. And I think this is the first important part that I like to talk about, which is representation, right? So we talk about representation in books and magazines and in movies. And as a white woman, that can seem like a really odd topic to talk about. But this is why I think the conversation of diversity and inclusion is so important in this broader scope, is that I never saw anyone like me. I saw plenty of white people. That wasn't the issue. But I didn't see any people living the existence that I was living. And so I didn't know what to do as a 12-year-old girl faced with this situation. And so the only representation I knew was a little girl who had kinky red hair, and her name was Annie. And so some of you may be familiar with the movie Annie, right? And if you're familiar with Annie, then you know, like all good Hollywood endings, right? It's happily ever after. Annie, although she lives in an orphanage, is ultimately adopted by Daddy Warbucks and goes to live in a mansion, get a dog, and have the life we all dream of, right? That's the, I mean, we can't get much better than a Hollywood ending than that. And so I thought, gosh, maybe foster care really is the answer for me. If I can get placed into foster care, then I too will get adopted by Daddy Warbucks. Now I'll tell you, I'm much older now and I'm still waiting to get adopted by Daddy Warbucks. So if anybody on the call wants to do an adult adoption, I've never been adopted, so still available, right? Because I think that's what a lot of people think about when they think about foster care, that there is this happily ever after. And for me, I thought, yeah, the state is providing the best parents possible. And so I called the authorities, and a police officer and a social worker showed up to my grandmother's little apartment to interview me. Now, before they came, I made a promise to myself that I would tell them the least amount of information I could, right? Because in my mind, that kept me out of that being a tattletale or being a snitch, right? It would keep me in this little safe box. And so when they arrived, I told them the truth, but not the whole truth, right? I told them this very narrow story, which was my mom suffered from alcohol and drug addiction. That was the truth. And that we didn't know where she was. Also the truth. What I left out of that 20-minute interview was all the physical, emotional, and the sexual abuse that had been occurring prior to. Because I didn't want to get anyone in trouble. And with that very narrow story, a decision was made that I would be placed in care, and I was removed from my grandmother's home. I was placed in the back of my first of many social workers' cars, and I was toted off to find a placement. I would never again see my grandmother. And in fact, it would be many years before I knew that my grandmother passed away while I was in care. But it's also in that time where nobody ever again asked me my story. My story remained in the courts and with my workers, that same story that I told in that first 20-minute interview. And so I spent the next 6 years in foster care, and I would eventually age out at the age of 18. Unfortunately for me, I turned 18 halfway through my senior year of high school. So when I aged out, it meant that at midnight of your 18th birthday, you were on your own. You had to have housing and a way of supporting yourself. All I was trying to do was get a high school diploma, but I was faced with becoming homeless in the middle of winter in December, because that happens to be when I was going to turn 18, right? I didn't choose my birthday, but there it is. And I had to come up with a plan. And so I lived in my last foster home. So I went through approximately 35 or 40 foster placements in 5 years, group homes, various different kinds of private foster homes, and was never adopted. And now I was faced with this idea of what would I do? My last foster home was in a rural location, so we did not have public transportation. There were no apartments or rooms for me to rent that were nearby my high school, so I could walk. And to be honest, getting my high school diploma for me was like the big goal. My dream was to get my high school diploma. No one in my family had had a high school diploma. And I was going to continue working at a hardware store that I had gotten as a part-time job during high school. And that was it. Like, that was the big life plan. It wasn't anything fancy, but I didn't know how I was going to get a high school diploma. And so coming home from my job one day, I thought, perhaps my foster parents would let me stay if I continued paying them what they'd been receiving for the state for my care, because I knew that that amount of money was much less than an apartment, a car, insurance, like all of these things that, minimum wage. We're talking about living wages a lot right now, but minimum wage for me was $3.25 an hour. And it wasn't going to pay for housing. It wasn't going to pay for a car. It wasn't going to pay for insurance or gas or any of those things. And Netflix and cell phones weren't even options when I was a kid, right? So, I feel fortunate and unfortunate with that. Nothing I did was recorded, which is the bonus of that. So I came home and asked my foster parents, and they agreed to allow me to stay under the conditions that they got a $50 a month raise. Now, with the $50 a month raise, it meant that if I worked my maximum number of hours, which at the time was 28 hours, if you were a kid in high school, you could only work 28 hours a week. That was the law. I had $0 left. I actually owed them like $2.50, I think, if we technically figured it out at the end of the month. So I was in the hole. But I agreed because it was the only way I could see getting my high school diploma. And so I had to go without things like toothpaste and feminine hygiene products and deodorant, which you can imagine makes you really popular in high school when you don't have basic personal hygiene met. And I went without food very often because I couldn't find it or afford it. But it kept a roof over my head so I could graduate from high school. And when I graduated from high school, I made a promise to myself that I would never talk about foster care again. And I was really great at keeping that promise for almost 25 years. So when I graduated from high school, in that time from negotiating with my foster parents to graduation, a teacher asked me what my plan was after high school. And I shared with her that I was going to work at this store, and I thought they would give me more hours, and eventually I'd be able to get a little studio apartment and take the city bus to my job and eke out an existence. And she thought that was a really terrible idea. She thought that I should apply to college. And I thought she was crazy because kids like me didn't go to college. And lots of the social workers and judges and attorneys and foster parents that I had been in contact with, although they never said it to me, their body language and the way that I was treated said it to me, right? Everybody was waiting for me to turn into my mother. And I heard it in the way they talked and in the way they talked about what my goals should be and what I should be doing. And when I sat on that court bench every 90 days having a review hearing and no one asking me if I had the things that I needed, right? I had no voice and no choice in that. So I knew what people expected from me. People expected me, like my mom, to be a teenager who became pregnant, right? With a father who was unknown. They expected me to have an early addiction or a criminal history very early on. I heard them say things like, she's fine at 14, but wait till she turns 15, right? I heard those whispers and murmurs and, well, it seems okay now, but just give it a few more months, right? Like always waiting for me to have this bad behavior. And for a long time, I lived up to that. I acted in ways that made that true. So when this teacher suggested college, I just thought she had lost her mind. And so she sent me down to the academic guidance counselor and said, talk to him and decide where you can apply to school. And so I went to his office because this was a stern teacher, a firm teacher, right? When she told you to do something, you did it and you didn't really question. And I went down and he took one look at me and said, Shen, kids like you don't go to college. Kids like you learn to serve people like me. And when I share that story, oftentimes, live with audiences, I hear sighs or gasps about that. But the truth is that 18-year-old girl sitting across from him believed him because everyone thought that. He had just been the first one to verbally express it. I thought it, and every adult I knew thought it. And I said, I know I don't belong in college, but can you please go tell Mrs. Clark? Because I don't want to tell her, you tell her, right? And so he sent me back to her class and she was super excited to hear where I was going to apply. And so I shared with her the story that I just shared with you. And I don't know if you've seen the horror movie where the little girl's head can spin around and she can spew things. But that's sort of what Mrs. Clark looked like that day when I shared the story with her. And I tell you that for 25 years, I thought she was angry with me that day. It turns out now in reflection that I know why she was so angry. But Mrs. Clark committed that she would help me apply to college. And so she wrote and got applications to local community schools and local state schools and asked me to fill out the applications. But when I began reviewing the applications, it became quite clear to me that college wasn't in my future because I couldn't pay the application fee. There was an application fee to my community college. There was an application fee everywhere, some of them $30, $60, $100. I couldn't afford any of them. And so I brought back the blank application fees to Mrs. Clark and I explained my problem. And the problem, of course, was that all my money was still going to rent. And so Mrs. Clark took a look at it and on a public school teacher wrote me a check for $125 to apply to her alma mater. Now, I didn't ask Mrs. Clark where her alma mater was, but it turns out it was Michigan State University. And so go green, right? It was the kindness of a stranger that changed the trajectory of my life. And it's a story that I share now often because I don't think people should have to rely on the kindness of strangers to be given the opportunity to live into their purpose. Now, it may seem that that's the happily ever after. Mrs. Clark does this beautiful deed for me. I do get into Michigan State. You already know how much I love Michigan State, but it wasn't my happily ever after. To be truthful, I moved onto campus and I was completely overwhelmed. I was an almost 19-year-old girl, but I was functioning at about a 13 or 14-year-old level. I had no skills or ability to be living on my own. I wasn't prepared to be completely on my own. And in my first 90 days of campus, I attempted suicide 3 times. In the process of coming to taking control of my life and having some realizations with the help of a really great counselor on MSU's campus, it became clear that I needed to start working. And so what began as a journey for me, I applied to a job as a law office receptionist, in which I thought they'd be crazy to hire me, but they did hire me for $3.25 an hour. And I began working that job, and it turned out that I was really good at that job. I ended up becoming a legal secretary and then a paralegal. And by the time I was 21, I was a law office director and I was hiring and firing law clerks. In the process of that, I hired a law clerk that I stayed married to for 25 years, right? And we decided to open a law practice in a little rural community in Michigan because we were going to do law differently. And what we began to notice very quickly was that our clients had similar patterns And we began to ask ourselves a question: how could we help our clients make better decisions? Which, when I say that now, is a really naive question. It's kind of a dumb question, to be honest, but it's where we started on our journey of understanding this. Now, please know, I did not disclose to my husband my past. We did not talk about it at all. But what we began learning from our clients was that a lot of our clients had spent time in foster care. We were primarily doing criminal defense work at the time. And one client in particular's story hit so close to home because it was so similar to my own, that I began to Google foster care statistics. Like most of us who have a trauma story or trauma history, we begin to think that we're the only ones and that we live on an island and we're the only ones who have experienced some kind of trauma or adversity, or the trauma or adversity that we've experienced hasn't been experienced by anyone else. And I believed that. I didn't know how many foster kids there were. It felt like I was the only one because nobody was saying they were a foster kid, and I didn't know any other foster kids. And so what I quickly began to understand is that things like incarceration and some of the statistics that Sylvia mentioned at the beginning, things like homelessness, education and unemployment, substance abuse and misuse, young girls who were pregnant, all began with this idea of early adversity. And so I became really interested in the things that happen to us and how that leads us to be where we are. How was I in the position that I was in, but yet many of the clients that I was working with who had similar stories to my own were in vastly different places than me. And so because of a story that a client shared, I came home and told my husband I was going to write a book, Garbage Bag Suitcase, about my time before, during, and after care. But that really the goal was not to talk about the trauma necessarily, but talk about what are we going to do about it, right? It's so expansive. And so that led me to the Adverse Childhood Experience study. That led me, if you don't know, to Dr. Vincent Filetti, who was a doctor from San Diego, California, right? Here we go, full circle moments. It's like Kaiser Permanente, the hospital I was born at, right? He was an obesity doctor. He was working with patients who had 200, 300, 400 pounds of weight to lose. We're talking about like morbidity, right? On a very large scale. And so Dr. Filetti's work really was trying to understand why some of his patients could follow his diet and exercise plan, lose the weight, keep it off, and live happily ever after. But this other 50% of his patients were following the same diet and exercise plan and were either losing very little weight or gaining weight, actually. And he was trying to understand why. And so the first piece of this is that he actually felt that the patients who were not losing weight were trying harder than the patients who were losing weight. And so this began to frustrate him because he knew it wasn't about effort, which is sometimes the first thing we go to is like, you're just not doing enough, right? Do more. And he didn't feel that way. And so he actually started thinking it had something to do with body image. So as I tell this story, I just want to say, right, a lot of trigger warning in some of the stuff that I'm talking about, because it can strike close to home very quickly. So please know, please always take care of yourself first, then listen to me. If you need to check out, I understand and can appreciate that. And so he thought it has to be body image, right? And so for a lot of the women on this call, especially, right, we've been looking at magazines of very thin women for a long time, and he thought that that might have something to do with it. And as we progress into the 21st century, we know pretty much every image we see now is Photoshopped, right? Like this is something we just, men, women, children, dogs, everybody is Photoshopped now. So he thought that that may be playing into it. And so he had this particular patient who had actually gained and lost hundreds of pounds multiple times in his office, but she would leave for long periods of time and he would lose contact and then she would come back. And he talks about just his frustration with this particular client. And she had reemerged and he was sort of at his wit's end with her. And one day, spontaneously, he just asked her, "How much did you weigh at the time of your first sexual experience?" Now, I don't know about anybody on this call, but my weight is a closely guarded state secret. I wouldn't tell you. I mean, you could kidnap me and tell me you would release me if I would tell you my weight, and I would still lie to you about what my weight is, right? I am just not, I will tell you my age. I will tell you all kinds of personal classified information, but I don't know why I would not tell you my weight. And if a doctor would have asked me this question, I would have lied straight to his face, to be perfectly honest. We are fortunate that this patient did not lie. This patient said that she was 44 pounds at the time of her first sexual experience, which of course means that she's the victim of child sexual abuse. Now, Dr. Filetti didn't just have some breakthrough aha moment when she said that, but he made note of it. And what he noticed is that after he asked the question, she began disclosing lots of things that had happened to her in her childhood beyond child sexual abuse. And it got him thinking in a different way from body image and photoshopped images into just the things that happened to us before we turn the age of 18. And so he began asking his other patients about their childhood and the way they were raised and the things they happened. And he began to notice a pattern that emerged. His clients who were having difficulty losing weight had much more traumatic or adverse childhoods than the patients that were losing the weight following a diet and exercise plan. And so what came up with is what became known as the Adverse Childhood Experience Quiz. Now, if you Google that, you'll get the full questions. This is just like the version for us to see and talk about here, right? And so these were yes/no questions. If you answered yes, you got 1 point. If you answered no, you got 0 points. And I'll use myself just as the key point. Nobody needs to like take this and share their number. We're not going to ask for numbers ever, right? So the questions were, before the age of 18, had you ever suffered from physical, emotional, or sexual abuse? Before the age of 18, had you ever suffered from physical or emotional neglect? And before the age of 18, did you live with someone who suffered from a mental illness? Did someone you live with, were they incarcerated? Was your mother or stepmother treated violently, whether you witnessed it or not? Did someone in your home suffer from substance abuse? And a big one that gets a lot of attention is not just, was there a divorce between your parents before the age of 18, but was there a divorce, a loss, or a separation from a biological parent? So if I take this, I'm a 9. But to be honest with you, the first time I was introduced to this concept, I was a 3. And then the second time I convinced myself, I was a 5. And eventually I came to understand and grasp the 9. And the reason we do this is many of us struggle, even to ourselves, to admit the things that have happened to us. And so it's not uncommon for someone's number to change as they become more comfortable disclosing more information, because this is self-disclosure, right? You only know what I tell you, and you don't know what I don't tell you. So it's very common for people not to give you the whole story. So Dr. Filetti began giving this to his patients. And what he noticed is that his patients who said yes to 4 or more of these were his patients who were struggling to lose weight. So just in his office there in San Diego, that's what he began to notice. And so he began to ask other peers and colleagues, did they think he was onto something, because it felt like he was onto something. And frankly, the medical community basically laughed him out of all the conversations. They said, this isn't, no, you're crazy. This has nothing. Why would this have anything to do with people losing weight? Well, we're fortunate that someone from the CDC, we're all very familiar with them now, heard him speak and thought he might be onto something, but he has a really small sample size. So they partnered with Dr. Robert Anda, and they decided to actually do a real study to see if they could reproduce Dr. Filetti's results. And so they looked at 14,000 individuals in the San Diego area as part of a big Kaiser Permanente study where they could follow and look at medical records. It's important to note that in the first original study, most of the people were white, most of the people were college educated and considered themselves middle class. I think this is really important as we talk about this, and we're gonna come back to that. So in the original study, that's who was asked and determined. It's not typically the population that we think of of traumatized population, right? We're not usually thinking about white, middle-class, college educated for our traumatized population. And so what they found is that 2/3 of that population had suffered from adverse childhood experiences. And so with 2/3 of the population, they began to see some correlations. And some of these aren't surprising, right? If you grew up in a family with alcoholism, it's likely that you would suffer from alcoholism. This is a fact that many of us have heard time and time again, right? It increases your chances. That isn't the significant part of this study. The significant part of this study were things that your ACE score determined your likelihood of cancer and was connected to your likelihood of cancer more than secondhand smoke and lung cancer. That your connection to heart disease and your ACE score is much higher than your family history in heart disease. This became the groundbreaking part of adverse childhood experience study, because why would the things that happen to you in childhood have any bearing on your physical health later in life? So we learned that people who have scores of 4 or more were likely to die 20 years before their peers, right? And as you're thinking about something like COVID right now, in the communities in which COVID struck more harshly, this becomes even more interesting. So the question became, well, why is that? Why would there be this link to physical and mental health based on the things that happened to you prior to 18? Because remember, that's what Filetti was looking at, right? The things that happened to us prior to the age of 18. And so what we know is that there is a stronger link between childhood trauma and addiction than there is between obesity and diabetes. We know that 2/3 of addicts report being abused as children. And so to understand the real depths of this, we're going to talk about this image here in just a minute, is we have to understand what's happening in the brain. So I told you I live in rural northern Michigan right now, right? So we have bears. It's a real thing. I know you guys have a bear on your flag, but I'm pretty sure you shouldn't have a bear on your flag, and we should have a bear on our flag, but that's how it goes, right? And so it is very possible that I might just happen out to my mailbox and see a bear. And so if you just happen upon a bear, something happens. You have fight, flight, freeze response. Some of you may have heard this term before, right? I'm going to introduce you to a new concept of fight, flight, freeze, appease, which is really important. This is our survival instinct that kicks in, right? That keeps us alive, that let us escape from lions back in the day, right? When we were really fighting for our lives. It's a really valuable thing. And when it happens, we release a chemical called cortisol. It's supposed to last 7 seconds. It's really good for us. What we found is that people who grow up in abuse and in dysfunction are releasing that cortisol, are living in that survival brain 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. And that when you're releasing it at those kinds of levels, that it actually begins to change us biologically, will actually begin to corrode us from the inside out. And so that's why we begin to see the connection to these physical disease in the body, right? Is that it's actually changing us. So the events that are occurring to us begin to change us. So if you've been hearing recently where we're talking about racism as a health crisis, right? And you're thinking, what would racism have to do with health? This is what it has to do with health, because people are living in survival mode, and it can begin to physically change them on the inside and make them prone to different types of diseases. So it's a really critical component to first understand. So now we could spend hours and days on just adverse childhood experiences. We could talk about, well, what about things that happen to us post turning 18 years, right? And what about this study that you said was conducted with mostly white college educated people? How does that apply to the rest of the world? Well, it turns out that we've redone the study with lots of different populations. In fact, the country of Japan, just prior to COVID, did a nationwide ACEs exam. And it turns out that it doesn't matter what type of people we look at, how we try to categorize the people, the statistics remain the same. The other important thing to note that we can't jump into all at once with adverse childhood experiences is that those 10 things are not the only adversities you can face pre-18 or post-18, right? There's all kinds of others. And if I asked you in the chat, I'm sure you could come up with some, but like food insecurity, bullying, a sick sibling or the death of a sibling or loved one, war, famine, racism, right? All of these can be things that we look at as well. So the adverse childhood experience study, by the way, was begun in the early to mid 90s. We're actually getting ready to talk about celebrating 30 years of this information. It's not super groundbreaking work. And so in the last 30 years, it's been developed and gone further and deeper. So we used to talk about something called the pair of ACEs that was introduced to us by Dr. Wendy Ellis out of Georgetown. And Wendy would talk about the pair of ACEs. So in other words, the leaves of the tree were the adverse childhood experiences we just talked about, but that there were actually things in that tree's roots that caused those leaves to happen as well, right? Things like not having affordable housing or food scarcity or bad schools or structural racism or poverty or violence in neighborhoods, right? That those things in the roots could cause some of the adverse childhood experiences that we saw. And that became known as pair of ACEs. And that work was a huge breakthrough in this work. And then we had COVID-19 happen. And suddenly we began to see that there's really 3 realms of ACEs as well. That yes, there is still that root work. Yes, there's adverse childhood experiences, but we can also have some impact from the outside, from the environment. And this became the work following Hurricane Katrina specifically. And then we saw in full force, especially during and now, if we're calling this post-pandemic, epidemic, I don't know, someone can help us with that language, right? Is that things can happen in the environment that can impact the roots, that can impact the types of leaves that we get as well. And so it's important that we have sort of this 30,000 foot view of what ACEs really is, right? So the study often talks about those things we spent some time on, but know that we know there's these other impacts as well. And you can see why suddenly we could be on this call for a week or two, just talking and dissecting some of these things. I love to do it. If you want to jump on a call with me, I'll spend hours and hours with you talking about it. So when we talk about that survival mechanism, that's the fight, flight, freeze we're talking about. But I want to introduce you to the concept that appease is also a survival mechanism. And I say that because many people who come to these calls of these conferences on a Wednesday night when you could be doing 100 other types of things are because we're appeasers and fixers. We want to fix it for everyone, right? We don't see ourselves in those other places, but appease can be our survival instinct as well. So when we talk about that bear, those of us that will fight the bear to survive, those of us that will flight or try to run as fast as we can from the bear, those of us that freeze and don't know what to do when we see the bear, and those of us who try to make friends with the bear so that he doesn't attack us, right? We're the appeasers. We try to fix it. We try to make everyone feel better, even when it's to our own detriment. And so that's an important piece, because when we're in survival brain, we cannot be in executive functioning. And executive functioning is where logic and reasoning exist. And this is important when we think about our communities in crisis, is that if we're responding from survival brain, we can't be in logic and reasoning. So when the bear's chasing you, you're not thinking about your homework that's due tomorrow. You're not thinking about what's for dinner later. You're not thinking about what your 5-year strategic plan is. You're thinking about surviving this second in this hour, not in the future. So that seems like a lot of bad news, right? Like, Shen, you said you've got this high ACE score, you're going to die 20 years before anyone else. Like, tick, tick, your time is ticking down. But what we also know is that there's a counter to trauma. It is only one side of a coin, right? And that it only tells you part of the story. The other part is resilience. If you're not familiar with the work of the Center for the Developing Child at Harvard, I highly recommend you spend some time on their website. They are the experts on resilience. It turns out that there aren't just people who are lucky and born with resilience. or grit or that pull yourself up by your bootstraps mentality. It turns out that it's a learned behavior, and that because the brain is learning all the time, it can be learned at any age. And there's three components primarily to how do we build resilience: positive, stable relationships, faith and cultural traditions, and mastery of a skill. And what we know about all three of those, although we're not going to get into the details of them tonight, is that they're all about connections and being connected to other people, right? So we know that isolation is really bad for us, and we're seeing the effects of that because we've all been isolated from each other so much over the last 2 years. The other counter is positive childhood experiences. So although there was a whole study done on adverse childhood experiences, positive childhood experiences are those positive things that happen to us, right? So as I was telling you, in all of the tragedy and trauma of my childhood, there are positive, good memories as well. And so we know participating in community traditions, feeling a sense of belonging, having at least two adults, they don't have to be your parents, that take interest in you, that care for you, right? Feeling safe and protected. These are all things that can help us build resilience as well. And I see that somebody asked about the Harvard.
Rosie has a question, yeah.
Yeah, it's the Center for the Developing Child, and I'm typing that in at Harvard. And a quick Google search will bring up the exact website for you. And so this is a question I'm going to pose to you all, which is, what are you doing differently? So many of you are in organizations where you're probably talking about becoming trauma-informed or doing trauma-informed work, right? It's kind of a big buzzword. There's all these federal ARPA dollars everyone needs to spend, and they're tied to trauma-informed work, right? And so what I like to talk about, right? Let's go to a big view of like a community or an organization, is that we can be trauma ignorant. There are people who absolutely, some of them are your elected officials, believe it or not, who don't know that trauma impacts people. So that's one step. Then there's trauma aware. We know that exists, but we don't do anything to change. And then there's trauma informed. That's the big buzzword right now. But that's the knowledge piece. So yeah, I'm informed about trauma. I came to a lecture, I heard about it, I'm informed. And a lot of people think that's where it ends. I'm sort of the buzzkill, because then there's trauma ready, right? Like, wait, this is more than just a technical piece. It's not just about knowing it. It's really about this other piece. It's about trauma implementation, where we embed and embody it. It's the framework for which we see all the other work, all the other programs that we do. Doesn't matter what the program is. I hear about all kinds of great programs, but are you doing it through this lens? Because especially when we're talking about things like diversity, equity, inclusion. I know you have Corey Best, who's going to come on as a speaker series. Corey and I are great friends. He's amazing. And part of that work is it's not either or. You cannot do diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging work and not do trauma-informed work. And you can't do trauma-informed work without doing that, right? It's the same. And so getting on the page and understanding that these things work together. So when we think about that, we often think about the training component. Okay, well, let's get everyone the knowledge. And this is no matter what you're doing in your organization. I know I'll get Sylvia to nod her head. Whatever you're trying to implement organizationally, right? You start with training, right? Sylvia's got to get everyone, all the staff needs to be trained. So we have the same knowledge and understanding, maybe even some of the same language. But then what happens? Then we go back to our offices, we have emergencies, we're dealing with real life thing. We sort of forget everything we learned, and then we just go back to doing the work the way we've always done the work. The real challenge is then, do you change the commitments? Do you have tools to change the practice so you can shift the culture, right? So these are building blocks. They're not linear. They're building and helping each other move from one to the other. And that when we talk about something like trauma, what we're saying is it's something that overwhelms a person's ability to cope. So what overwhelms me may be vastly different than what overwhelms Tracy, right? And what overwhelms Tracy, right? Right now, I know what overwhelms Tracy is she doesn't have her passport extended. That's what's overwhelming her. But that might not overwhelm me, right? And so then that leaves them to feel powerless and outside the realm of, quote, normal human experience. If we had more time, we would explore this idea of normal. It's a really important one because how I grew up, many people would think is abnormal, but that's how my brain functions and thinks. And it thinks through that lens of what others consider abnormal. And so we have to take that into context of the whole person as well, right? And so when you hear this trauma informed, if you can think about it as the framework. So what happens in systems and organizations and businesses, right, is that we're selling a widget, we're doing a service, or we're giving a product to somebody. And so we begin building the walls of our house. But what most of us have forgotten to do is build the foundation. And so our walls are a little bit loose, right? A strong wind or a crisis comes and they wobble a lot because they're not mounted to anything firm and concrete. So what trauma informed is really the framework that helps you see where all the other work is going. It's not additional work. It's the framework to help you see everything else. And once people can start to understand that, it seems a little bit easier for folks to grasp. So the one piece that I really, really want to leave you with is shifting the paradigm. So hopefully some of you have heard this, that we're trying to stop the language of what's wrong with you. Sylvia, what's wrong with you? Why do you act that way? Why are you doing that, right? That's like, we want to stop that. And a lot of people have gotten really good at moving to the what's happened to you. And I want to introduce you to, it's not just happened. Some of us are living real time. It's happening right now in the present tense, the experience that's impacting the way in which we see things. So moving from what's wrong with you to what's happened or happening to you is a really valuable one. But the one I want to push you even further, because Oprah's been pushing this, right? If you're an Oprah fan, she's been pushing what's happening to you for a really long time. But I want to push it further than that, which is what's strong in you. How can you stand on the things that happen to you as a strength, right? Because if we can move from problem focused to solution focused, it changes the whole story. So if you have an employee who you feel like is bossy or impulsive or oppositional, and you begin to see them in a solution focused way, wait, they're a visionary, they're a natural leader, right? It changes the whole story. If you see that kid as demanding or defiant versus being bold or determined or having strong beliefs, the way in which you see that individual changes. And so this is the paradigm in trauma informed that we're trying to move to. That person just wants attention. What if they're seeking connection, right? So I say all behavior is attention seeking, is connection seeking. I'll do anything. I will stand over here so you'll see me. And that behavior can get worse and worse. And by the way, this works with anybody. Think about your favorite Netflix show or politicians, perhaps, that might be attention seeking. Why are they attention seeking? Are they connection seeking, right? So all those behaviors you see that sometimes frustrate you, when we begin to shift the paradigm, we shift the story and we really get to root cause. So I'm not going to share this video with you, but what I'd like you to do is take a look at the still face experiment if you have time. And I'll type that. You could just go to YouTube. There's lots of them. It's really important to understand that most of the way in which we connect with each other is not verbally, but it's through our non-verbal language. So if we walk into a room and we look very upset or angry, that will spread and other people will instantly become upset and angry. If we walk into a room smiling and bright and happy and joyful and laughing, it will immediately lift the room. And there's scientific reasons that we know that actually our body language is contagious and our feelings are contagious. So I want to sort of stop us at 9:15 9:15 my time, not 9:15, 6:15 your time, to do some Q&A. But I want to introduce two really important other and often overlooked trauma symptoms that you might be seeing in your organizations, in your families, or with clients that you work with, right? We can see these anyway. And so the first one I want to talk about is reenactments. Some of you might have been introduced to this in something called the drama triangle. And so very similar language. What we know is that we're often recreating events that have occurred to us in our past with new people and in new circumstances. And we're doing it all the time because the brain's like a computer. And so it gets fast by recreating things that have already happened. So oftentimes whenever we're communicating with people, we're in a reenactment almost all the time. We're just not aware that we are. And someone is usually a victim, someone's usually a persecutor, and someone's usually a rescuer. And someone can play more than one role, right? So this can happen just in a two conversation. If Sylvia and I are in a conversation, we can be moving between those roles, right? And it's just what you think. The victim is the victim. Sometimes if we think about it, that's our kids, if you're a parent, or the client you're working with, right? Or the stubborn partner or spouse. And then someone is the rescuer. It's the person who wants to fix it and save everybody and do everything. And they know exactly what needs to be done, right? To fix this for everyone. And there's the persecutor. Why don't you listen? Why can't you, right? Accusatory. They're frustrated typically. To break a reenactment, we have to do things drastically different. So first you have to recognize you're in a reenactment, and you know you're in a reenactment because the same thing keeps happening. For instance, I'm sure this hasn't happened to any of you, but you go to an office meeting and it feels like you've had this meeting 6 times. You talk about the same things, but you never come to a different conclusion. You are probably in a reenactment, right? And so how do you break a reenactment? First, you need to recognize you're in it. And then second, you have to do something drastically different to change it, because the brain keeps reacting the same because it's predicting what will happen and that everyone will play the role that they always play. And so when someone plays a different role, it can drastically change it. And what you're trying to do is move the victim to driver. You're trying to empower that person specifically to take control and to take charge. And we do this by coaching and supporting. So if you're a rescuer and you're always used to fixing it, you have to change to supporter. How could I help you? What would it look like? How could you solve that, right? And the persecutor, instead of the accusation, instead of if you would just listen to what I tell you, right? Do as I say, not as I do, moves into asking those really powerful coaching questions. What is it you want? Because when we move the victim to driver, that's where healing begins. It turns out we can't love people out of their trauma, but we can empower them to heal out of their trauma. And that's what we're trying to do. So this is a really important piece of this work. And we often don't get to it when we're talking about adverse childhood experience. It sort of comes further down. But I think it's so critical because when you can start recognizing these, you can start doing different behaviors. And I'll just give you a quick example. I was working in a residential facility, right? These are the youth who are supposedly really bad. And the staff knew and understood reenactments. And they knew with one child in particular that they were in a reenactment, but they couldn't figure out how to break the reenactment, right? So every time at bedtime, it was the same thing. And then this kid would end up throwing things, and it was turning into them, really aggressive situations. The staff was having to do restraints, and they knew that they were in a reenactment, but they didn't know how to break it. And so sometimes you have to introduce somebody else to help you. And so I came in the same behavior, by the way, right? Kids pushing the same buttons and yelling and using all kinds of 4-letter words. And I just said, after a 4-letter word, "Thank you so much for telling me how you feel." Now, when you're yelling and swearing at somebody, you don't expect them to thank you, right? It's not what you're expecting. And that's the thing that broke the reenactment, right? We sometimes think about it as the de-escalation, but he wasn't expecting someone to thank him. And so then his brain didn't know what to do next. And that's how we can break a reenactment to begin moving in sort of a succinct way. There's lots of ways. The other thing I wanted to bring up is disassociation. So if you've ever been driving, I know how much California residents love to drive. I know it's your favorite pastime, right? But you look up and you're like, oh my gosh, where am I? Did I miss my exit? Right? You have that moment of like, wait, where am I? That's disassociation. And it's actually a good and a bad thing, right? There's plenty of things that we need to, from time to time, disassociate from, and it's perfectly healthy for us. But we can disassociate, and then it can make things complicated, and it can also be unhealthy as well. And so this is why we talk about mindfulness, is that oftentimes we come to something, we may come to a meeting and people are thinking about 600 other things, and then we're just trying to get through an agenda. And if we just took 3 minutes to do a mindfulness and bring everyone, right? People disassociate less and we actually get more done. But most of us feel like, oh, I don't have time for mindfulness. But because we don't have time for it, we actually get less done. We would just spend a few minutes doing some mindfulness and connecting first. So things to respond to if you have someone who's disassociating, or if you don't know, like, could they be somewhere else, is developing emotionally intelligent practices, strong interpersonal relationships, awareness of your triggers, which we're not going to get into today, but it's another critical component. Having sensory strategies. This is why things like fidget spinners and things like that can be really helpful to have around, even in the meetings with adults, y'all. It's not just about the clients you serve. I want to remind you, 2/3 of the population suffers from that, and that includes all of us, right? This isn't just those people over there, it's us, and it starts with us. All of this work starts with us. 2 other things before we go to questions that I just want to make you aware of and to think about is that there's a term called collective disturbance, that sometimes something can happen that will disturb the whole ship. COVID is a prime example of a collective disturbance, but they can be other things. Maybe a new leader or somebody retires from a role, right? Any big thing that affects everyone in an organization can be another trauma symptom. And so making sure that you have a way in your organization or your community, and this is why I think rituals are so important, is have you debriefed about COVID and how COVID's affected everybody? Have you talked about the positives of COVID, the negatives of COVID? Did everyone get a voice in talking about that? Most of us, when there's a collective disturbance, have been taught in organizations to deal with the crisis, but then pretend it never happened and move on. For both big things like COVID and things that happen within our communities, right? There's events that happen with our communities that can affect us and cause collective disturbance. And sometimes we just try to ignore them instead of dealing with them and talking about them. And then the other concept is parallel process. It turns out that we just mimic behavior, both positively and negatively, of those around us. So if you're a leader and you're saying, gosh, I wish my staff would take care of themselves, the first thing I'll ask you is, do you take care of yourself? Do you use your PTO? Do you do the things you want your staff to do? I have principals all the time at schools tell me, I just want my teachers to take a lunch, but yet none of my principals take a lunch. This is a negative parallel process. If you would like others to take a lunch, then you should take a lunch, because we learn from the behavior. And so if our leaders don't take care of themselves, the learned culture is we don't care for ourselves. We just keep working. We work and we work and we work. And so I know we hate to hear it, but we have to start with ourselves, right? We have to be the people we want other people to be. So some of you I see getting nervous, like, I know I don't take care of myself, and I know I want my staff, or I want other people. Or you live in a family and you feel like, gosh, my kids are always so busy. I wonder where they learned that behavior from, right? Who taught them that behavior, I wonder. So these are important concepts to think about as we talk about this. Now, I wouldn't be doing my job well if we didn't just spend 1 minute on something called self-care. Now, I do not like the language of self-care. Let me be honest, because what most people think of as self-care is doing something that gives them joy, right? Going to a movie with friends, getting together with friends, watching a funny movie, going shopping, whatever that is, a glass of wine, whatever your thing is, no judgment from me, right? That's actually only part of self-care. And it's why most people think it doesn't work or they don't have time for it. The other part of self-care is our personal development. How are you addressing the needs and the things that you need, right? We've all suffered. So it is doing the things that give you joy, but it's also doing that deep work. Have you thought about tolerations, boundaries, limitations, right? Do you have unresolved things that you're not dealing with? And maybe you came to this work because you can ignore it. I only know and can speak of that from personal experience, right? As a person who ran from my own personal trauma story for 25 years. And then there's trigger care. Things happen that trigger us, part of our personal development that we have to work on. But when we're with somebody, if our daily self-care is, I like to go for a run. I do not, but maybe that's your thing. If someone triggers you and you're in the moment with that person, you typically can't say, hey, Tracy, hold that thought. I got to go for a run real quick and then we'll come back and deal with your issue, right? You're not able to do that. So triggers are telling you that you're leaving executive functioning and you're going to survival brain. But we got to have you here more often, right? So what do you do in the moment to stay present, to be there quickly? Have you thought about it? And then after the event happens, how do you process it? So that it's not the same things triggering you over and over and over and over again. This is a big part of self-care. And then crisis care, when the unimaginable happens, and it happens to all of us, right? There's a death, someone loses their job, a divorce, these really big, heavy, an illness of some kind, COVID-19, right? In crisis, what most people say is, I better hope my tank is filled because now it's all hands on deck for the crisis. That's the absolute wrong way to view it. Actually, in crisis, we need you to be caring for yourself more than ever because you're using more gas than ever. If you think about it in driving, on a regular day, you just could drive around town at 20 miles an hour. You can get really far on a tank of gas. But in a crisis, you might be at a stoplight and then going to 100 miles an hour and then stopping, and then 100 miles an hour and stopping, and you're going to use a lot of gas. So you need to be refilling your tank in a crisis more. What I was preaching during COVID-19, during self-care webinars with people from all over the world was, you need to be spending 2/3 of your time caring for yourself and your staff and 1/3 on all these projects you think that you need to do. In crisis, connection, being together is more important than anything else. If it's the one piece of advice I can give you, the agenda will get done if people know you care about them. And people need to know you care about them because you care about each other and because you've already spent the time building those connections, and that people have a way to say, I can't do anymore. People have to have a way to tap out. So I'm just going to leave you with this, and then I'll get off the screen and we'll go to questions. What I know from doing this work for several decades is that if we don't do this work, we will see the continued amount of generations affected, and that there are children who, by the way, become adults who've never known love or safety or stability. And while we have patience for them when they're younger than 18, they turn 18 and it becomes harder for us to hold our empathy and our understanding about what their true stories are. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and come back and see if you have any questions about any of that material.
Absolutely. So at this time, if you have any questions, you can either take yourself off mute, you can raise your hand, or if you don't want to do either of those, put it in the chat and we will be monitoring the chat to get those questions answered. So we have one from Andy Estrada at AVPH. Overall, is appeasement as a survival response unhealthy? Thank you, Andy.
Andy, thanks for the question. So the truth is that they're all healthy and unhealthy, right? It's yes, and it's that, I mean, they're there for us to survive. And so that of itself makes them all healthy responses. It's the overuse of any of them that can make it unhealthy, right? So when we hear something like a fight response, of course, everyone immediately thinks about physical fighting, right? But fighting can come in a lot of different ways. It can come with our verbal words. It can come in the way that we treat people, both verbally and non-verbally, right? Those can all be fight mode, right? In flight mode, we think about people who just run away, but it could also be avoidance. Maybe you have someone on your team who doesn't answer the email, right? Or there's the email we're avoiding. Those can all be survival. And so appeasement is the same, is that there's a time for it where it's really healthy to just appease the situation and move on. But if it's our constant, always trying to appease, we can often think about domestically violent situations, right? Where if I just do enough, this person won't get mad at me and won't react that way any longer. Appeasement really came out of understanding domestic abuse survivors, is that they were constantly trying to do things right from a survival mode. Like if everything's in place and in order, then we're much safer. But it can be just as unhealthy as any of the other responses if it's overused. So I hope that helps, Andy.
Yes, thank you so much. You're an amazing teacher. I learned a lot. Thank you. Of
Oh, thanks so much, Andy. I appreciate that.
course, thank you.
Did we have any other questions? Again, if you wanted to raise your hand, if you want to take yourself off mute, or we can put it in the chat, either of those work. So we'll see if we have any other or comments.
I just want to, it's not necessarily a question, but I've been to a lot of different trainings that involve ACEs. That's the hot topic here in California. It's
right.
Huge funding happening right now, right? And everybody wants a piece of it. But I think the way you explained it tonight was on such your regular person friendly type way, you know what I mean? Because you can go to these presentations and all of a sudden it's all just really clinical terms, and really they put it on a level that it's like, I know I went to school and I know I should really understand this, and I'm not sure if I do, but I really do appreciate the way that you presented it, because it just, I think at some point everybody here can connect to something that you said, in terms of ACEs. So I just really want to say thank you, because that was like, it just really like even gave me some aha moments of like, that's what that meant, so so thank you.
Thanks, Sylvia. Thanks for that. It's really my passion. And I tell people this all the time, that I feel like my gift, it took me a long time to figure out what my gift was. I can't sing. I'm really a poor dancer. I can't play an instrument or carry a tune, right? I'm not artistic, but I think what my skill is taking complicated information for the rest of us. Like, what does that mean for me? And how does that appear in my life? And so there's lots of examples of seeing people in the grocery store freaking out. And then, right, it's very easy to be like, what's wrong with that person? What's their problem? And then starting to see it from what's really happening here. This isn't about someone not finding peanut butter or not being able to return something, right? There's more at play than what we're fully seeing. And so that's my passion. As you can tell, I would love to dive deep into all of these things, right? Like, let's spend 3 hours talking about collective disturbance. Let's talk about reenactments, because they happen so much and so frequently. And that we're all like, I'm fortunate because I get to work in school districts. I get to work in nonprofit human services. I get to work in local and state governments. It's really interesting in California. I've sort of been called in to do all these different projects in like really strange places, like child support services, right? And in these places where they're just now having these ahas, right? Which is funny because you guys had Nadine Burke-Harris as your Surgeon General there for a while, and her work in The Deepest Well is all on adverse childhood experiences. And so I'm still constantly surprised with my Californians, like, okay, the study originated with you all. You had Nadine Burke-Harris, who was like a huge advocate of this work. And yet, like, for the state, it's still coming to realize, how does this actually impact us and our communities, and what are we doing about it? And I think when you talk with Corey, is he coming next week? I think, right,
Next
Tracy?
Wednesday. Yeah, he's next Wednesday.
Is that it's that other building block to it, right? It's like, oh, that's why we begin to see how these things correlate and coalesce and come together. And why are communities of color impacted by COVID-19? Well, because we know communities of color are affected by adversity and trauma at higher rates, right? So it begins to make us start seeing this much more vivid problem and focus.
Shen, I'm going to read to you a couple of comments in the chat from
Sure.
Iris. We have, thank you very much for your time and presentation. Your heartfelt presentation is definitely what I personally and professionally feel will support my caseworkers at the school sites to grow in their role. So thank you.
Oh, Iris, thank you. I do a ton of work in schools, Iris, so call me. We can have all kinds of great conversations.
Yeah, and just so you know, we will be, this is being recorded, so we will be putting this on YouTube. This will be sent to all of you, as will the slide deck. And Rosie, problem focused, solution focused. I need that slide, please, Ms. Chefalo. I'll need to share it. We are going to. My friends, we need to go to the city council and need to prepare. We're having students present their spoken word poetry slam pieces.
Oh, yes.
And then Iris said, thank you. So I want to be respectful of time. I know we're at 6:26. So again, if anybody had any final comments or
well, and Shenandoah doesn't know this yet, but this is not the last time we're going to see her. She's going to be coming back for more conversations. So this isn't the end.
Sylvia, thank you so much.
Yeah,
So here's the great thing. When your name is Shenandoah Chefalo, you're super easy to find on social media too.
That's true.
Because here's the thing, ladies and gentlemen, I'm the only one. I am the only Shenandoah Chefalo, so you can always find me there too.
That doesn't surprise me. And I think my only complaint about tonight's presentation is that there wasn't 200 people here to hear you, because it was really very, very informative. So again, it's 6:27. So I did want to let everybody know, again, this will be sent to you, and also the presentation. If we could give everybody a round of, if everybody can give Shenandoah a round of virtual applause, thank you so much. And finally, we did have Adele saying, thank you for a very inspiring topic and speaker. I won't forget your name, because your name is in the song of John Denver's "Take Me Home, Country Road."
It sure is. It is, and people sing it to me all the time. It's fine.
So again, this was brought to you by Best Start, Antelope Valley, Region 5. We want to, again, thank you so much, Shen. It really was very, very informative. Next week, we will have Corey Best, as Shen mentioned. So if that's something of an interest to you, I will send out the flyer as well, so you can sign up for him. And thank you so much for spending your Wednesday with us. We really appreciate it. So enjoy the rest of your week.
Thank you, Shenandoah.
Thanks for having me, everyone.
Get some rest. I know it's late.